Well, do we want to... Do y'all want me to watch this the last 5 minutes, or do we...
put it on Zoom or something? I don't know. Yeah, let's watch it.
Okay, share the screen. Somehow
the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
This dude learns nothing.
This is Queers at the End of the World, the podcast where the only food you've found to scavenge in months is a shipping container full of funfetti frosting. So now it's your birthday all year. I'm your host, Nina.
And I'm your host, Nat.
And today we're talking with Professor TreaAndrea Russworm, who writes and teaches about video games and new media culture, African-American pop culture, and cultural studies, including an entire class on dystopian games. We're so excited to get to be with her today. She just finished The Last of Us 2. I mean, I just finished The Last of Us 2 right here on the podcast, but she finished it like a day or two ago, and we're going to talk about it. So get ready for big spoilers and big feelings from all of us.
So, gaming scholar, new media scholar, Anna Everett organized a conference at UC Santa Barbara called Afro Geeks when I was in graduate school. And so I was like, I gotta go to this. I don't know what an Afro Geek is, but I'm pretty sure that's me. So I went and presented on The Sims. And so it's kind of always doing like game playing on my own and game studies a little ad hoc on the side. And then also studying like the 60s and 70s, because I ended up writing about 60s and 70s Black popular culture as a part of my like dissertation stuff. So that's kind of how I started to fuse the two things early on. But then it really wasn't until I was at UMass and just said one day, I want to teach a class on games. And I really framed it as it was a class on dystopias, which I still teach. And I framed it as comics, new media, and video games was going to be like a unit in that. But then it just sort of grew and became the main part of the class. And so, yeah, and then I just started writing about games. It was like I started teaching that class, which became really popular. And my department is big enough that they didn't need me to teach other classes. So then I created a game studies specialization and created new classes to go into the specialization. And so now I just teach game studies classes and write about games. After I published Blackness is Burning, which was my sort of refresh of the dissertation, I pretty much have worked mostly on games since then.
And it sounds like you've been playing games since you were a kid.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember playing Pac-Man at my aunt's house and their Atari. So that's probably the earliest memory I have of playing a video game. And then I had, all the systems growing up after that.
One of the things that we talked about when we were kind of talking about our own game histories on the show was like kind of access to console and the place in the family pecking order, like and things like that. Like we had all the consoles in my house too, but it was definitely like I was not touching that controller until many losses had occurred down the line of brothers. So
right.
Were you like able to get the controller in your house?
Well, I grew up as an only child. I do have a brother, but we're 15 years apart. So when I was growing up, I would either go to my grandmother's house. I have an aunt who's just a few years older than me. So my younger aunt had, in that context, I was low on the totem pole. Like I would wait until other people weren't playing to play. But growing up as an only child, I eventually got my own systems. And so there was never that particular thing. But, Samantha Blackman at Purdue University, we wrote an article last year on Black women in video games. And a section of that article interviews Black women gaming scholars. And like we all tell our origin stories. So I remember talking about Pac-Man and like being at my aunt's house and like hanging out with the boys because I was always, all of my friends were boys. And beating them in certain games, but also collecting like He-Man dolls or He-Man action figures. My earliest memories or impressions of games are fused with these other like toys and objects as well. And then also kind of like, I don't know, sort of gender boundary breaking play in my neighborhood. Yeah. You know, when I realized I wanted to teach classes on video games, it was actually kind of accidental that I ended up teaching a class on dystopias, because I just didn't want at the time to create an intro to game studies class that seemed a little bit daunting, and I didn't know how popular it would be, although I probably could have guessed. And so I had to theme the class in some way. And I chose dystopias only because there were so many damn dystopian games. And so when I was trying to organize it and I was picking up like a wish list of games that I might want to talk about, I realized the common thread was that they were post-apocalyptic or dystopias in some way. So yeah, that's how I ended up teaching a class on dystopias, and then just kind of kept it going.
So it was games that led you to dystopias and not the other way around?
Absolutely, yes.
I know that the course has evolved over the course of 10 years, and I'm just curious what games you're teaching with in that class lately. And I know you just finished teaching a section of it, so maybe some of the ones that bubble to the top as the most interesting objects.
Yeah, so in the class, I run the class as a team-based class, so students are in teams the entire semester. So sometimes we play a game as a class all the way through. In recent years, it's been Detroit Become Human. It wasn't this year. We didn't play it. So sometimes for the first part of the semester, we play a game together and analyze and talk about it, or we play snippets of games. We usually play snippets of games and talk about them. But then each team is responsible for playing one game. So this semester, Tacoma, The Walking Dead Season 4, Far Cry 5, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. But so the thing about that is I have a list that I sort of present to the class, and I say, these are games you cannot choose, because there are certain dystopian games that are favorites that I'm pretty sick of talking about. And so I have a banned list, that because I have taught the class for 10 years and I usually teach it every semester. So, games like BioShock is on the banned list. All of the BioShocks, I've taught them enough. Half-Life, and these are games that are definitely worth talking about as dystopian games. But again, I just need to keep it fresh for myself. So, another favorite is Portal.
That is an absolute classic.
Oh yeah, Portal is the one where like your gun makes interdimensional doors instead of like regular old holes, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The students love Portal and often want to play it, and it's great to think about, I think. But again, I sort of tapped out on it.
That seems like a really fun experience.
Do you feel like you have a sense now of like why so many games are dystopias?
That's the question, that's the question we ask every semester. I don't know. You have to catch me on a good day. So like, I think I have a cynical response and a more hopeful response. I think the cynical response is more, there is this investment in seeing the worst. There's this investment in imagining the worst. And in the best case scenarios, dystopias are these cautionary tales that people can learn from. But I think that because dystopias in popular culture are so prevalent, they're such a norm in a lot of ways, actually. It really isn't just video games. Obviously young adult fiction in general, television series, it's the thing. And so now my more cynical take on it is this sort of, I don't know, it's this chronic enmeshment and a sense of nihilism and hopelessness that just prevails. And it's our fascination with that and our acceptance that this is the probability more so than these are the things to avoid, these are the things to fight, these are the things to challenge. A certain sense of like, complacency and like deja vu can set in when that's all you see. We've seen the repetitious cycle of the same kinds of constructs and the same kinds of stories and the same kinds of endings, right? The conventions of dystopias are exhaustively repetitious.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing you say that, of course, I'm immediately thinking just of like what it must have been like to teach this class like during COVID this semester, because it's like there's this sort of exhausting litany of this narrative. And then like there's a sense that like, okay, and now we're kind of like living in that reality right now. It makes me wonder if the students talked about it differently this semester, or if there was a new facet to it, just looking at 2020 along with the sort of 10-year history of talking about dystopias prior to now.
Absolutely. It's absolutely different. So I was teaching the class in the spring, when the pandemic started. So I gave students a bunch of different options. And then, in that moment, most of the students, 2/3 of the students still wanted to talk about dystopia. But we shifted gears to really talk about what was happening around us a lot more than I ever have in teaching the class. And so they wanted a way to process what was happening. And so then the class became, had this sense of urgency to it, I think. Teaching the class during a moment when there was more consensus that we're in a dystopia.
Right.
Because we've been in a dystopia, but students would not agree. So unilaterally, students now, I asked that question on the first day of classes, are we in a dystopia? Why are we not? As a way of getting students to introduce themselves. 90% of the students said yes. Whatever their understanding of dystopia was, we met it. So I think teaching it in the fall made me a better instructor. Teaching it both times made me a better instructor, but teaching it in the fall, I reframed it a lot because at the end of the semester of last year, in the spring of 2020, I realized we don't need any more dystopias. I don't want to talk about dystopias for the entire semester. I want to be able to understand what a dystopia is, how that applies to what we're living, what are some of the historical functions of the dystopian narrative, the dystopian vehicle, what makes a good dystopian fiction. Why, I wanted to be able to understand that and talk about that, but I also wanted to start pivoting to something else that is not dystopia. And so by the time I taught it this fall, and I don't think this would have happened if we weren't also very clearly if we weren't going through a global pandemic and living in a dystopia in a way that more people could understand it and agree. So I worked a lot with the concept of the critical utopia and, utopian thinking and utopian thought and interventions. There were other themes that I made more prevalent in the course this time. That I think were really important for students to see and understand and figure out that what we need are better options, and dystopia is not always the way to get there.
So that's something else you're talking about, is other options besides like just recognizing that the system is bad.
Right. What are the options for survival? So the thing that is encouraging, but about, most of the popular dystopias, what you see in the more popular dystopias are, badass people who are resisting, who are trying to change. In the best of the dystopias, in the best of the worst, you see badass people who are fighting for change. And so to focus on that as a part of what we take away from what dystopias can offer us and how we can leverage that to now into action, into vision, into actions, I think was the missing component of that class. And hopefully it will always be there to really think about what action looks like, what resistance looks like in the dystopia, rather than just kind of being like enamored with the dystopian frame and concept. But thinking about, your heroes in all of these dystopian tales are usually fighting for something. They're usually trying to fight to change the system. Not always, but in the best of them, they are trying to fight to change the system.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like what they're fighting for is maybe the dividing line between the kinds of dystopias that have like some kind of like, utopian or like queer thrust, like in terms of thinking about like queerness as like just something else, in like the broadest sense. Yeah. And the question is sort of like, what is it that the resistance is for? Like, is it for reinstating something from the past, or is it for something new?
Yeah. And most often it's for reinstating something from the past. It's for fighting for what we already had, for getting back to whatever was construed as normal. And so, I think what was helpful and instructive about listening to what people are calling for in this moment is for us not to return to what was pre-existing. That pre-existing was part of the problem. Pre-existing structures, pre-existing resources, organizations, this was part of the problem. This is why, the pandemic is so bad in the United States. Part of the reasons why it's so bad. So I think students got that, and it wasn't a struggle because Well, one of the exercises we do is once we figure out, what are some tactics of like dystopian repressive regimes, and we figure out, how to understand that in the context of dystopian media narratives, we just applied those to the headlines in any news outlet, in any newspaper or news outlet that you want. Go and see how many of these different tactics are relevant in the life that we're living today. And students are like, all of them. It's like basically, it doesn't take very long to figure out that, like, oh, all of the things that we said are bad about like what the dark future can hold, we see that happening around us, So, but for activists and organizers to call for, the radical change, for radically reimagining, what we need on the other side, I think is the kind of call to action that we want people to feel when they play a dystopian game or they watch a dystopian film. But quite often that doesn't happen, right? Because the object, the material contains its own sort of like cathartic effect. You go through all of the emotions and you imagine all of these things, but it's so contained to that experience, and it's not applicable. It doesn't feel applicable or relatable, or you don't have the desire to do that because you're already spent. You already lived it. I lived it in my gaming life, or I lived it in my reading life or my viewing life, and it was hard, and I did it, and I fought through it. But how to get from that space to, what we need outside of those texts. So that's kind of what I'm focused on now. And I don't think I would have been as committed or as aware. I mean, after all the years of teaching the class, that was a component that was missing. I mean, we're good. I'm in an English department. We're really good at the theoretical, right? This is one of the critiques, is that we're really good at telling you why it's bad and how it's bad and really understanding how fucked up it is. But, then what? What else will change it? And not just theoretically what will change it, but how do you put those ideas into action? So I'm much more interested in having the class try to do that type of work around creative projects, and then around tangible, like when you leave this class. I teach that classes for seniors. So it's really sort of like this crucial moment where it's all seniors, they're graduating. So where do you go from here?
Yeah, I love the idea of sort of talking about video games as a starting point, and then like noticing these certain kinds of oppressive themes or threats, and then being able to say like the thought pattern you go through is like you see something in real life and you're like, oh, that's just like in blah 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 game.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the reaction I had in that game when I see that thing in real life. And like when I had the reaction in the game in my class, I was like, this is wrong and this is bad. Now I can like kind of come out of that and be like, the systems in games are also existing in real life. And that reaction that I had there is a reaction that I can and in fact should have here if I stand by the moral orientation I brought to the gameplay.
Right.
I that's so great. Like, I just love that as like a pedagogical attitude about like breaking out of that shell that, I mean, games create a shell too, for the reason you exactly said. It's like this contained experience, but you're saying like, no longer is this contained. It never really should have been, and it wasn't, but people made it that way, Or I feel like there's this escapist thing of like wanting to play things out and then have it just be separate.
Right.
It's not separate.
It wasn't. Yeah, that's the thing, is that games are tough because it's the play space, it's the entertainment, it's the toy. I mean, it's the I'm going to do this because I need a break from the pandemic, so I'm going to play a pandemic game, to get a break from the pandemic. Which, interestingly enough, the dystopian films were all bestsellers again why are you making that turn? It's, maybe pre-pandemic or prior to that moment, it might be escape, but we already know there's a pedagogical purpose in the works. And that's partly why people turn to them. Why is Contagion like a bestseller? Why did it like crash Apple servers in March and April? Because everybody's downloading this film, where it's an outbreak, that started potentially with the bat and,
Right.
took over. People had to socially distance. And it was really similar, to what we're seeing with COVID-19. So people are not watching that to relax. They're watching that to figure shit out. They're watching that to see how this ends. They're watching that to learn something. There's always a culture war around games and, their social significance or their political significance. There's always this, the hey, games are also a space to relax. They are that. And they are, teaching us, and we're learning and we're receiving information whether we want to or not. And they're not created in this escapist vacuum whatsoever, right? They're created in context, and so we play them in context. But what I think and what I propose is that even in the relaxing play spaces, I think basically when you finish a game, you kind of need a debriefing process. You need to talk about it. Like we're going to talk about The Last of Us 2. Yep. You need a debriefing document, conversation, something. You need a discourse community, right? Because I think it can help you make more clear how you can apply it to now or what you can do if that's your ambition and you don't want to just leave it as this contained, frustrating, unnerving, or illuminating experience. What do you want to do, with what you've gained from that experience? So,
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I obviously feel like the next question is how do we apply that to The Last of Us 2?
Yes. Okay.
Like if you guys are ready to go there now, just to contextualize, I didn't get a chance to watch it. So Nina, I'm going to let you kind of talk back and forth with TreaAndrea a little bit and just listen and not minding spoilers at all.
Awesome. So psyched. Well, I mean, I feel like we are like just the luckiest people in the world because we get to talk to you like right after you finish this game. I was thinking like a good place to begin is just kind of where we left off when we finished episode 1 was this kind of like imaginary bubble around that episode where The Last of Us 2 didn't exist. And we were trying to like imagine a beautiful future for Ellie. And I don't know if you got to hear the end of that, but we were like thinking about Ellie like just having some other options than just like going back into the sort of persona, which is this like murderous clone of Joel. And that like we could remember that there are other things that one can do in the world, like say, make cordyceps art installations or like become the person who like looks for other folks who are immune, like maybe she's not the only one, questions like that. And none of that happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I did listen to the episode and it was great. It was great to hear that and think about it. I think that's a great exercise. It's a really important project, I think. It's a really important process to see, like, can we imagine even what's better than this? And again, that's one of my cautionary takes on so much dystopian fiction and media is that it's not imagining that at all. It's not giving us the literacy. It's not giving us the rhetoric or the imagination to do that work. It's only giving us the imagination to see like, oh yeah, I know about zombies, but it's not giving us any ability to really dream in a radical and restorative way. So I love that part of your episode in dreaming, we don't get it, not in The Last of Us 2. We don't get anything like it. Like there's so many good options. So, I'm really bad at plot and sort of summarizing what happens. But if let's say like, plot is like 3 or 4 sentences of what happens in The Last of Us 2. Well, Joel is killed in The Last of Us 2 right away.
The first half an hour. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, whoa, he's murdered in the first minutes, it seems, of this game. Ellie actually sees the murder. He's captured, and then I think she stumbles in on it, and they capture her. But she actually watches the character Abby murder him with a golf club. I think.
Golf club.
It's pretty
I feel like she's been thinking about that for years. Like she definitely found that putter on some like overgrown golf course outside of Seattle. And she was like, "This is
This
the
is
one."
how I'm gonna do it, motherfucker. I'm gonna take you out. So part of what you play, a good half of what you're playing in the game is as Ellie killing to avenge Joel's death. You know, she's finding these people who are part of this group and killing them. And the big leader, you know, the woman who kills the person who kills Joel is Abby, and that's Ellie. That's Ellie's quest. And then, you know, structurally, this game is really interesting to me in so many ways. But you do that, you play a half of it as Ellie. You know, from an identification standpoint, you're like committed to Ellie because that was the only choice you had, was playing as Ellie, who's on this quest for revenge, whether you agree with it or not, whether you think it's a good idea, because you're like, oh, Ellie, by the way, you're immune. Why can't we go do something else with our time? Yeah. I mean, Joel is dead. It's too bad, but there's a lot of shit going on that you might be able to help solve if you were just trying to find his killers and kill them. But then you have to switch and play as Abby.
Yeah, so you've like played more than half the game. You fought your way through Seattle with your pregnant girlfriend at your side, murdering all these members of the Seattle militia group, until you finally find yourself face to face with Abby, and all of a sudden the game just switches perspectives, and you find yourself back like in time a few days before, playing the game as Abby and meeting all these people that are Abby's friends and Abby's like compatriots, and they are the exact same people you just killed.
And when I had to watch walkthroughs to get through certain parts of this game, and you know, I would read the comments on the walkthroughs, and people lost their shit. They hated the structure, which is fascinating to me when people don't like something. I'm really intrigued by it. They hated the shift to Abby because they've already attached to Ellie and this revenge plot. They hated shifting to Abby and playing from her side. And you don't just play as Abby, like withstanding Ellie's murderous hunt. You know, you actually play these other moments in Abby's life. And so you play as her for like a chunk of the story. And you find out she's the daughter of this doctor that Joel murdered in the Fireflies in part 1. So this is her revenge tale. That's why she kills Joel, is because he murdered her people, her father, people who were working toward a vaccine. He murdered all of the scientists, all the potential revolutionary scientists who were scientists and doctors and organizers. Marlene, I've never forgiven this story and the direction of murdering Marlene when and you actually get to play through and see her empathetic response that, yeah, it might end up sacrificing Ellie, and she's trying to talk to Joel about it. There might even have been a middle ground. I don't know. We don't know. It wasn't imagined in this text, but you get to see from that perspective what happened and why Abby is pissed off and goes and hunts down Joel and murders him early in the game. And in my opinion, in my experience, Abby's story and Abby's side was such a relief. It was so much more interesting. It was so queer. It was so... I was just like, the people in Abby's universe I liked better as well. You know, her friends. So you play as Abby, and then the game culminates. This is a long way of saying the plot, but the game culminates. You play as Abby, you see who her people are, and there's the trans character. Lev is one of the characters that Abby takes under her wing. There was a lot of commentary about, you know, the character design of these characters and even the plot, the subplot with Lev, the character and his sister. Anyway, Abby and Ellie have a lot of fisticuffs moments, which I'm really interested in because these are battles for recognition. But they have this big battle, and Abby has the chance to kill Ellie. But Lev, who's the trans character, is like her conscience and is like, don't do it. You don't want to become this. And so Abby frees Ellie yet again, lets her go. You know, Ellie's like beat to crap, and Dina, who's Ellie's girlfriend and pregnant, there's a whole subplot. The family, the queer family unit, you know, Abby lets them all live, except for accidentally like killing the baby's daddy because Dina's pregnant. So she kills the baby's daddy.
So many pregnancies, so many queer family units. It's like we're going to brunch or something at like one of my 30-year-old queer friends.
So many queer family units there that it's like hard to explain. But there's a symmetry there because Ellie kills Abby's ex-boyfriend's girlfriend is pregnant, and Ellie murders the pregnant woman. And so the symmetry is that Abby doesn't do that. She has a moral center that Ellie doesn't have. And she's like, bitch, basically, she's like, basically, I don't ever want to see you. Don't ever let me see you. You know, she doesn't swear. And he leaves her alive, you know, and that is, you think, the end of the game, but it is not. There's still like 10% more of the game after that ultimate, you know, battle between these two. And the last few moments, you find out that Abby and Lev, you play as Abby, and then her friend Lev, who she takes under her wing, they get captured by, I guess, human traffickers, by Fedra, which is like a militia military group, but they basically human trafficking as well. Like, I don't know, I haven't looked at.
Right. I mean, it's sort of what's become of the cops.
Yeah, exactly. So they are captured by them and tortured and really lynched. There's a lot of lynching in this game. They're almost lynched. Yeah. And Ellie can't let it go, even though she has a queertopia. So at those last moments, Ellie has gone back with her girlfriend Dina. Dina gives birth to this adorable baby, video game baby. So cute with these big.
They did a good job on the cutest baby.
Around on the farm, and you get to see. But Ellie is also suffering from post-traumatic stress because she's murdered all these people and still grieving the loss of Joel. And so, you know, she has the chance to embrace something else other than revenge. And she decides to forsake the queer family unit that she has and potential future, and says, no, I still got to go find Abby. after all of that, she's like, I got to go find her again. So the worst, saddest moment in my video game playing history, I think, of this final battle between Ellie and Abby in the ocean. Both of them, like, Ellie has been cut or something. She's like wounded and limping. Abby, who, by the way, has been the physically strongest character in the game. She was a beast.
Yeah, she's ripped.
And awesome. Yeah. And so she's emaciated because she's been captured for X number of months or whatever. She's lost her muscles, and you have to fight as them in this water, in the ocean, and you're basically choking Abby. And I tried to fail at this so many times. I tried to do nothing and let Abby kill Ellie, because I'm like, look, you had so many chances here, and you can't get over it. You can't do that.
It won't let you
do that. And it was so awful. And so it's quick time events. So you're pushing X, you know, to hold X to like choke the crap out of her, or hold square to choke the crap out of her. And then finally, Ellie has some inkling of moral grounding and just walks away, you know, and lets Abby live. And Lev, the trans character, is like in the boat, half dead as well. And then they sail off in their sad little boat. And you're back as Ellie for the last few moments. There's more flashbacks with Joel. So that's not an efficient way of summarizing the game. But you can probably tell through my summary of the game how I feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that comes up there. I mean, there's so many scenes and places we could drill down on, and all of these queer relationship configurations. There's dead babies. There's some queer ex-evangelical representation, which I'm kind of excited about. And I mean, there's way more than we can discuss in half an hour, but I guess one thing that comes up for me, you know, the game's mechanics are still this very non-consensual, like there's still only ever one way for the story to go. But then time in this story, as you were pointing out, is just, it's a mess. So many flashbacks, fantasies, dreams, perspective switches.
And the flashback of a flashback of a flashback moments. There's so many of those subversions of time that people also don't like, but I like that they don't like it, you know, that you're always backtracking. You think you're progressing, and then it's like, oh, another flashback. It's from the teenage Ellie now instead of, you know, young adult Ellie, because we had to go back and tell you this. So Joel is actually in this game a lot, even though he's dead.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder if those flashbacks aren't the game being a little bit self-aware with how preoccupied it is with the past, you know?
Yeah.
Like all of these characters that are just so obsessed with looking backward.
It has to be. It's because it's almost a joke at a certain point. Like, you literally can play a flashback within a flashback. Because Abby's whole storyline is flashback, because you get to the moment where she's about to kill Ellie, and that's when her story starts. and then all of Abby's memories are also flashbacks within the flashback structure. So
Right.
it's got to be intentional. It's so like hyper done.
I mean, we get this one scene where Ellie finds out what Joel did in the Salt Lake City hospital.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. Did that go how you expected? Like what were your impressions of that scene, and like what you learned? Was it kind of what you thought you would learn about them? Like was there anything unexpected?
About the Fireflies or about Ellie?
About the Fireflies, about Ellie's reaction to it.
Yeah. No, it made me like the Fireflies even more, and it made
Yes.
Marlene's murder seems even more unnecessary, because what you do is
Yeah.
when you play as Abby, is it humanizes that whole team of what they were doing. You see your father, the surgeon, he's kind of dopey, but whatever, we'll go with it. And you still have the structure of, this is like this patriarchal revenge tale. Like, it's a revenge tale on behalf of the fathers who were killed, right? Like, that's what these young women characters are doing, is fighting for their fathers. They're fighting their fathers' fights, right? The whole time of this too. And so that's annoying. But you play as Abby, you see more of those folks who, again, I just found way more interesting than people in Ellie's group. She should have teamed up with them, but she couldn't. And so the one good thing that comes out of that is that she goes back to the hospital and figures out that he really was lying, and that it wasn't as he said, and she confronts him. So these are all wins in my book. Like, she's able to confront him, and she's not able to forgive him. She says, basically, fuck you. You need to tell me the truth right now, or else I'm leaving. And so he confesses to her. So I thought that it was a win that Ellie confronts him and is not okay with his decisions, right? She says she wanted her life to count, or her life to be which, not so much. She doesn't say like, I want a chance to save humanity, I want a chance to have a vaccine, but she wanted to be special. She's already special. So, she really wanted to be able to live that out. And Joel took that away from her and didn't allow her to make those decisions. Yeah. And then at the very end of the game, in the very last flashback that we just watched together, Ellie has, talked to Joel, because she's had her first kiss with Dina at that point. Again, it's another flashback that's kind of out of order. Yeah. But Joel says to her, basically, I would do it all over again. He's outright saying, do it all over again. I don't care that you're pissed at me. And so that is a crystallizing moment in the fight for recognition, which is something that I've written about and thought about a lot. And there's no mutuality there. So what we have is everybody dying for a relationship that has no intersubjective realization. It isn't a mutual.
Like, it just exists in Joel's head.
It's all fantasy. Yeah. Like Joel doesn't see Ellie. He has to be able to recognize Ellie's desires. That's part of recognizing a person as a person, and not as a construct, as your construct, as your self. Right. So he doesn't recognize that. He can't say, that is your wish, Ellie. I wish I had done it differently. I wish I had given you that chance, right? That's what we need. Yes. He's like, no, I haven't done it all over again, damn it.
Do it all over again. Like, my feelings are the most important.
And she says, well, I hate you for that, but I'll try to forgive you if I can.
But he's just like, well, that sounds great.
That sounds great. He's happy with that admission. Yeah. Like, I guess I'll try to forgive you, but I don't think I ever will. And that's how the relationship ends. And we see that what drives her is guilt over making being her own independent self, right?
Right. It's like, is her trying to forgive him then the whole rest of the game, wherein she murders dozens and dozens and dozens of people. That's what forgiving Joel looks like.
Everybody has to die, while Ellie grapples with the fact that she, didn't, she couldn't forgive him for that. So she's trying to forgive him through that violence. Not fun. None of that is fun. None of that was fun. But yeah.
No, fun is not a word that I would use to describe this game. Yeah. It's interesting too that moment of, like, you're talking about this, like, recognition and failure to recognize that Joel can't recognize Ellie's desires, doesn't really see her as a separate human being. And it's really interesting to me that they have that moment happen in the middle of like your standard coming out scene. Like they're like on the porch, and it's like Dad's like, she really likes you, and kind of showing himself to be this like accepting father, in the sense of the struggle in this game is not over whether or not he's going to be okay with her being queer. Like, but instead he, like, she's like, okay, well, fine, you know, like, you see that I'm like, you don't have a problem with me liking girls, but you did destroy my chances at happiness or like my chance to mean something in the world.
He's saying, because he's separating her queerness from her humanity. He's saying, okay, you're queer, you can be queer, I'm cool with that, maybe you should give that girl a try. But then he's saying, but I don't see you as a person. You know, you can have that
Right.
desire, but I don't see you as a person with overall independent desires for me. Her queerness is permissible to him, but her desire to be, you know, sacrificed for a vaccine or to fight with the fireflies or whatever, that stuff is not allowed, right? The more unforgivable self-distinction is the fact that she sees her future differently, you know, her future and her purpose in the world differently. So he's like, yeah, I don't care about your girlfriend, but no, you know, you can't be the vaccine. Like, you can't offer a vaccine to humanity. That's asking too much.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the way the game does representation as a whole, too. It's like, it's okay for you to be XYZ, like trans, black, queer, you know, Asian, like all the different not standard grizzled white guy characters, but not okay for you to be a person.
Yeah. Well, and it was not okay to be black in The Last of Us 2 either. Unfortunately, the black people get a raw deal yet again. You know, and I wrote about this in The Last of Us 1. I was like, you got to imagine, you know, with the two characters, the brothers, Henry and Sam, like, you got to imagine different outcomes because blackness is so overladen and overdetermined as a site of struggle in the apocalypse and not in the apocalypse, right? And we already have this litany, we already have this history of how blackness and suffering work out and play out in narrative culture and outside of narrative culture. You have to make different choices. There's a sort of special case to pay attention to. And in this case, the black people all die again. They're murdered.
Again.
You know?
Again.
So there are not that many significant black characters. We still have Marlene because she's in all these flashbacks, or she's in a couple of flashbacks. Right. So we're reminded of her importance in the previous one, and how that, you know, humanity was robbed of somebody like her. And then you have Isaac, who's a sadistic leader of the wolves. Like, he's a black man. And that was another one of the most disturbing moments in video games for me. And a moment where he's torturing there's like these torture chambers, and he's just his eyes are dead, and there's this nude person that he's like dismembered. Like, you don't see it happening, but you see the sort of aftermath of it, and him sitting there. He's a cold, heartless, he's a sadist. And that's the enclave that Abby is in, you know, the wolf the wolf group. And so he's the black dude. He's killed, though. I mean, just desserts, because they present him as an awful character. He's definitely no Marlene, so you don't feel cheated necessarily that he's murdered. And then one of Abby's other friends, Nora, is tortured by Ellie. Like, well, Nora was bad. Nora was like, I'm not telling you anything, you know, because Ellie's hunting down Abby's friends, and Nora is like, I'm not telling you anything. And immune Ellie, knocks her into the basement with all these spores, so she knows that Nora is going to turn. But then, even as Nora is turning, she like tortures her. You don't see all the torture, but you see some of it. Ellie tortures her, is like covered in her blood to find out where Abby is. So even as Nora is going to die anyway, Ellie is like ruthlessly Joel and beats the crap out of her, tortures her in some way. So those are the black people, as far as I can tell. Remember, there was a few, you know, other moments like other NPC characters. There's a couple there's one boss battle that's pretty disturbing, of this like really large black man who's like 3 times the size of all the other characters. And again, that's just felt like a missed opportunity, because it's a grotesque like black buck kind of trope. And so if you're going to do these over large characters, you want to have some cultural sensitivity and awareness, again, in terms of historical tropes, that you probably don't want to make that a black man. Like, play around with what that character is and represents. But it's pretty awful, and his expressions, his animations, and everything are awful. So that's the list of the black people. They don't survive the apocalypse yet again in The Last of Us, and can be murdered at will. So
No, I found that scene with Nora especially disturbing too, because it just felt like it mirrored the scene with Marlene at the end of The Last of Us 1 so much.
Totally.
It was one of the, like, including the, like, perspective from which you see her die, the, like, position she's in. And it felt just like, not only did they not learn, but they were just like, it just felt like they were like poking.
Yeah. No, they wanted that symmetry. They wanted to show that Ellie could go there. She could go to the dark place.
Yeah.
What really irritates me is how adored Joel is. So many people still love that father-daughter relationship that this game, forces, and can't critically navigate it. That Joel's pretty freaking terrible. And Ellie becoming Joel's also terrible. They get, at least in the comments and things that I read, they get that Ellie's quest for revenge is ruining her, but they don't really connect it to how horrible Joel was in the beginning. But that's because Black life has no consequence, right? So murdering the Fireflies, the resistance, the revolution, whatever that is, that's okay to kill off anyhow. And then, basically having like a Black woman as a central figure in that sect, also okay to kill. And so, but even the part about like Joel being pretty terrible, like it can't, people don't have a critical, read on that, again, because of the context, because Black life is so inconsequential.
Well, I'm really interested in that, like, just thinking about when people made it, like, both 1 and 2. I'm always just so curious with Last of Us franchise, in particular, if there was an interest in doing something like what they do in the game Spec Ops: The Line, which I haven't played, but I know is supposed to be an experience of playing as a murderer and slowly realizing that you are doing this and learning from having inhabited this role, the true horror of this and the horrors of war. And that, like, it's supposed to be this, like, sort of parable-esque story. And, like, with Last of Us 2, it's like, I can imagine there's someone on that team who's like, after you play this, you should realize that you were essentially playing as a mass murderer who's just going around killing people and basically just anybody that's in your path, just mowing them down. But then, like, I don't believe it's that self-aware from how it played out in both 1 and 2. And especially having heard the plot of 2, it's like, I have a real hard time believing that that's what they were all agreeing that they were going to do.
Well, I think there's no awareness around what it's doing with race. I think that it has a pretty low level, take on diversity and inclusion. Like, it has a diversity and inclusion optics or agenda, which is the very lowest level of entry there. So it has that because it has diverse representation. It has characters, from different race and ethnic groups, different gender presentations. Like, there's a lot of diversity in The Last of Us 2. What I think it wants you to be self-conscious and aware about that as like a good thing, that like, hey, we're progressive because we have this representation. It's not critical about its own stance on blackness, anti-Black racism. Like, it's not aware that that's going on at all. Ironically, even though it has this sort of diversity inclusion agenda light, we'll say. So there's that. But I do think it wants you to be self-aware about Ellie's moral decay. Like, I think it wants you to see, because you have Abby and you're playing as Abby, who pretty quickly seems to realize that, like, it haunts her that she killed Joe and how she killed Joe, even though she did do it to avenge her father. And even though Joel was wrong, he was wrong, and she avenged her father.
Very wrong.
Who murdered everybody. Like, I can't even really complain about that choice. But Abby learns really quickly that, that revenge imperative is killing her. It's not healthy for her. And so she then also maps on, sort of transfers all of her emotions and regrets and, stuff onto the trans character, Lev, and his sister that she has to fight for, because they're like become her moral compass. They are a member of an opposing group, from her team, and she crosses boundaries to save them. And so, but Abby learns these lessons earlier. So that's why I think it's pretty self-aware that, like, this revenge imperative is not the thing to live for, right? She is mapping and transferring all her shit onto these other characters as well. But I would argue that something closer to mutuality happens between her and at least Lev eventually. arguably. There's more of a chance there for that to blossom than anything in Ellie's life. And so Ellie doesn't seem to learn that until the very end. I think the game wants you to know that being on this murderous revenge quest is not what you need, right? It's not the healthy route.
Mm-hmm.
But it does so at such a high cost. That's its only investment.
Yeah.
Right. And nothing else really matters. No vision for what a future could look like. No possibility of a vaccine. I mean, Ellie is like Neo in the Matrix, because Keanu Reeves, Neo in the Matrix, drives me crazy because he's so clueless. Everybody is like, "You're the one." He's like, "Really? No." Ellie is like that, right? Like, you're immune. Have you ever met? She even has a real explicit conversation with somebody. Have you ever seen another immune person? And they're like, no, not really. Like, maybe I'm the only one who's immune. Like, you're the one. And she's so not about that, right? She says that was her. She regrets that Joel took that from her, but she doesn't create a way to make good on that. She doesn't create options for, using her immunity to save anybody. She only uses it to kill people. Like, oh, I don't need a mask when I'm like in this, area with spores. Like, I can't die from, the clickers, the zombies, whatever they are. She only uses it to her personal advantage. So the most frustrating thing that I was complaining about in The Last of Us 1 is it's this intersubjective, this narrow vision of what's good, between people. Yeah. It's very personal at the personal level. Yeah. It's intersubjective. Like, I get something from trying to recognize you. You get something from trying to recognize me that has no grander implications other than destruction in the case of the Ellie and Joel paradigm. So it's a cost to society that these two have this dialectic, right? This dialectic is toxic, it's poisonous, it's overvalued. And that's the thing that fans love. They love Joel. They love Joel. His decrepit, murderous self. They absolutely love this dude. But he's flawed. He's like good dad flawed, And he's a killer. He's a racist killer. Like, Ellie replicates that,
He replicates it. I think that's Naughty Dog. Like, honestly, that's what The Last of Us 2 has convinced me of, because, I think there's so many ways, like you were talking about all those parallels between the characters and their lives and the plot points. And there's, for Abby too, Abby's supposed to be this sort of better Ellie. And I think in a lot of ways it feels that way to play that character. But in the moment when Abby decides that Lev is the sort of like object for her, right? Like, it's like this literal moment where Lev is like, aren't they your people? And she says to him, you're my people now, right? And then they go about just carving a path through friend and foe. Like, you have people, you're talking about recognition, literally saying, Abby, what are you doing to Abby as she's shooting these people that are her comrades? And to me, I'm sitting there, watching that Let's Play and just thinking, like, did they get the news? Like, when did they get the news that Abby is like, a bad guy now? Like, how is it that Abby is completely unable to just like talk her way out of any of this? Like, has to kill every she comes across. That's so sad to me. So that makes me think it's the developers' inability to recognize that at any moment, and like, that like loving someone could mean anything other than killing everyone else.
Yeah.
And that loving someone in that sense is the goal. It's the primary purpose, right? It's our primary goal in the dystopia is to discover our humanity through our ability to love each other. Oh my God. Through romantic love or through, a familial kind of love, like a kinship love. Like, that's what saves us and what makes us human. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's equity. It's justice. It's systems that are fair. It's things that work. Like, this is what humanity is, not this interpersonal dyad above all else, right? The love your family, love your friends thing. Like, that's easy. That doesn't make you human, especially when you're murdering everyone. So, and I think, and it's tough because this game will be celebrated, or if it hasn't, I think it has been critiqued from what I could tell. I'm really just coming out of it. From what I could tell, the trans representation has gotten a lot of discussion and has been critiqued. the trauma porn aspect of it, you know. I mean, but that's what dystopias are. I don't think you can levy that charge against Naughty Dog, the trauma porn aspect, against this game and against Naughty Dog. It is what we get in our dystopian, you know, fictional diet of this is what we get. It's trauma, there's suffering, there's survival. Those motifs are hardwired into dystopian conventions. What we need are departures from those conventions, right? And you have to take a risk. And if you're going to be mass media, it is going to be like, you know, celebrated as art. It's going to be celebrated for taking all these risks. That's the kind of risk taking that we need, is to depart from, you know, the dystopia as trauma, as, you know, destruction, as nihilism format. There are lots of possibilities, even in the dystopia, to do something else. But what I wanted, so now if I can answer your question that you posed last time, I haven't really fleshed out what I would want at the end of The Last of Us 2, but I can tell you what, it's not choking Abby in the water, in the ocean, and like barely surviving, both of them, all of three of them barely leaving. It is teaming up. You know, why at some point in that story, Abby is the most badass character in a lot of ways. And as you say, she has her own symmetrical destructions and transferences and self-object creations to save her own soul, right? That's how it's pitched. But there's a lot of potential, I thought, in her over Ellie. And what I would love to see, and Lev, who is a really awesome character in so many ways, he was like sensitive and smart and philosophical, and there were some tropes there. You're like, oh, don't map this onto the Asian character like in stereotypical ways, but I think they kind of did enough of it to distance from that at times. So there was potential in that characterization for me to some extent. I want to see those people build an enclave together. Like, you inherited these other societies that you don't actually seem to enjoy. They don't work. So where is your formation? At the end of that, y'all should all be in the same boat, getting away from the crazy government militia group, getting away, go to Catalina Island, go to these spaces, create your own island together. I wanted all of them in the boat. Go off, like, Abby has the connection to the Fireflies and to their agenda. You know, Ellie is immune and Lev is like a philosopher. What more do you need? You know, like, you have all the ingredients for success right there. So I want that ending. And what Ellie does forsake is a kind of more normative, still queer family unit and structure. She forsakes that. And it doesn't have to be an either or. It doesn't, I mean, what she chose was revenge instead of that. And Dina was like, if you go after Abby, we're done. Like, that's not, I can deal with your trauma and your post-trauma and your flashbacks and your panic attacks in the barn, but I will not deal with this blinding rage that makes no freaking sense, right? So, you know, understandably, that unit dissolved. But it doesn't have to be either or. It can be all. Like, our definitions of what the future, of what expansiveness, what queerness look like, you know, don't have to be bound by that. Bring that little cute baby on in that boat too.
Yes,
like, everybody get in the boat. You know, that's where I want to be. That's where I would be going with this. And you know, people are like, happiness is boring. It's not now. No, it's not. Like, let's figure out what that could be. It doesn't have to be disingenuous. It doesn't have to be glazed over. You know, maybe there's some ways to do that. Maybe you still look grimy and you're still struggling and you're still fighting, but let's put those ingredients together and move forward, create a path.
Yeah.
But the other thing I will say, this is kind of my own kind of critical and personal investments, or I don't know, sort of pressure that I place on queer theory and queer game studies, is that if a fight for racial liberation and equity is not at the heart of it, then it's really not a fight for a queerness that works for me. Like, it's not the kind of queerness that I can envision. So you can have all the queerness and all the things, but if it doesn't have this radical, you know, orientation toward an anti-racist future, and call out, these structures and these conventions for what they are and make that a part of the critique, a part of the resistance, then it doesn't work well enough for me too. So you got to have some Black people in that boat, and they got to be pretty cool and contribute as well. And you can't just murder them all while we make our queer utopian escape here. So that's how I would reframe the game at the end, somewhere along. I wouldn't even wait till the end. You needed that break like a third of the way into it. Like that's the rest of the game that I want to play.
Yes.
Right. They're like the gun portal shows up, a hole opens in the temporal layering of The Last of Us 2. Marlene steps through it to take back the liberation.
Yes. She's like, come on. Like that's right. That's what I'm calling. Yeah.
Happiness is so not boring. Like, I was just thinking, like, when you were saying about, like, the idea of this, like, dyadic relationship, when there's, like, a happy ever after that results from that type of relationship formulation, I actually do find that a little bit boring. But this type of happiness is that other kind that would come from equity and you mentioned a bunch of things about like the kinds of structures that you would want to see as how people do mutual care in an apocalyptic or dystopian scenario. And happiness or goodness, like resulting from like the formulation of those structures, super, super not boring because we literally never see that. And something that we don't see in media could not possibly be boring because it's literally new and different from all of this other crap that we've been lingering in for so long.
My students tell me again and again, it is boring. They're like, we don't want to make utopias. It will be boring. Their argument is that you can't have a utopian video game because it wouldn't be fun to play. So when I make them redesign these games and I say create a critical utopia, they argue that it wouldn't be the franchise anymore. First of all, like Far Cry, they would try to make that. They did it though, and it was freaking cool. But anyway, initially their arguments are that it wouldn't make fun gameplay. What are we gonna do? We're just gonna like trade goods, like we're gonna have a commune. The action is central, and the action has to be violent, and the action has to be disruptive, right? And so they say that they don't want to play this, that this, it's like the old Batman versus Superman debate that like, why is Batman so popular and there's so many Batman movies? Because it's melancholic. Like Batman is freaking dysfunctional and has post-traumatic stress himself. And Superman was boring because perfection is boring.
But perfection, I mean, there's like so much ground to cover between perfection and like cutting a swath through people as you like insist on your dyad, like at all costs.
Oh yeah.
I mean, to me, that's a failure of a game design imagination to be unable to innovate a mechanic that would be compelling that doesn't correspond with senseless mass murder and anti-Blackness. Like, there's a lot of things that are fun to do and meaningful interactions that are not that.
There are those opportunities. And, I think we have to remember that utopia is not perfection. There's a misunderstanding that utopia is perfection, that it's paradise. No, utopia is a vision of unmet desires and how those desires are met. And so if we think about it that way, I think there's a lot of drama potentially in a utopia because you're striving to meet desires, right, in an imperfect way. And that road would be difficult to achieve, naturally difficult to achieve. Not only have we not imagined it, but even if we could imagine it, there will be a lot of dissenters. There will be a lot of conflict and strife. And there will be a lot of like problem solving and a lot of other things that would pop up in trying to move toward what meeting unmet desires actually looks like, and it's not going to be paradise. But yeah, those folks at the end of The Last of Us too, Abby and Lev and Ellie and, Dina, like bring all of them, put them in the boat. Nora, Marlene, like get all those people, get them in the boat and put them together. And I guarantee you it's not going to be paradise, right? But it's going to be better than those options that we have in those other spaces and those other communities.
Yes. Well, I think we should probably call it there, but it has been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming in.
No, thank you for processing this with me. Like, that helps me hold together my feelings and thoughts about this game. And right, it was hard to shake off. Like, now I feel like I can move on with my week, after playing it so aggressively, and now I can just like put it away.
I feel that. Oh my gosh. This has been Queers at the End of the World.
Next time, we'll be reading three books on survival in the wilderness. My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, Hatchet by Gary Paulson, and Into the Wild by John Krakauer. Think bears, think fires, think edible conflicts. It's gonna be great.
Our show art is by the fabulous Ellie Yanagasawa, who you can find for your own commission at Ellie the Cosmic Jelly. The music for this episode was La Fin des Haricots by Tintamare.
Hey, and I just wanted to say thanks to the YouTuber Danzigo8 who made both of the walkthroughs I used for The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2. I don't really know much about him except that he's British and he loves his dogs, but I spent a lot of time with his creations this year and just wanted to say thanks.
You can find us at queerworlds.com or at queerworldspodcast on Instagram.
If you enjoyed the show, we would really, really appreciate it if you'd rate and review us. It helps people find us, and it lets us know that you're out there listening.
And tell a friend who you think will enjoy it. That's by far the best way for folks to find out about the podcast.
Part of the point of all this is for us to talk to our community, so we'd love to hear back from you. Get in touch with us at queerworldspodcast@gmail.com. All right, good luck out there, dear hearts.